Okay, good evening. Welcome to the last Vancouver Kimberlite Cluster seminar of 2021. Thank you for tuning in, and it looks like we have folks from all over the world online tonight. I would like to introduce myself. I am Katherine Landoni, a Master's of Science student at UBC studying kimberlitic olivine under Kelly Russell, and I am the VKC host for this year. VKC is a series of seminars for diamond geology and related topics. Our goal is to bring together academics and industry professionals. I want to acknowledge SRK Consulting for being a long-standing VKC sponsor. Thank you. Okay, we are super well versed with Zoom at this point, but I just want to share our normal housekeeping notes to please keep your microphone and cameras off during the presentation because it helps with the quality of the streaming. The presentation will be about 50 minutes long, and I will help facilitate a questions and answer period at the end of the talk. So try to keep your questions for them or for then. After the questions and answers, like I mentioned, we'll stop the recording and then move on to a more informal social hour. So I'm delighted to welcome Murray Rayner for his talk, The Discovery and Geological History of the Argyle AK1 Diamond Deposit. After being born and raised in Perth, Murray finished his geology honors degree at University of Western Australia and started off as an underground geology in the Kimberleys at the Kajabut MVT zinc lead deposit, followed by a number of years underground at the Scuddles VHMS zinc copper deposit in the Murchison. This led into a consulting role across multiple commodities, including gold, iron ore, porphyry copper, Irish style zinc lead, manganese, mineral sands, lateritic, nickel, coal, bauxite, and diamonds across Australia, Indonesia, Iranian Jaya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Ireland. In 2003, Murray joined Argyle Diamonds in the Kimberleys of Western Australia and has been the competent person until the recent closure of mine production in November 2020, as well as the competent person for the Marawa diamond mine in Zimbabwe, the Bunder diamond prospect in India, and has been heavily involved with the Diavik diamond mine since 2005. While working with Rio Tinto, Murray has also worked on multiple commodities, including diamond, iron ore, porphyry copper, uranium, mineral sands, iron titanium across Australia, USA, Canada, Russia, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and India. Murray is currently a principal geologist doing resource evaluation for Rio Tinto Copper Technical. All right, so you can take it away, Murray.
Thanks very much, Katherine. I'll need to share screen again. And there we go. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks everyone for joining. Today, I'm doing a bit of a roadshow at the moment, to be honest. This is probably about my 5th or 6th talk. I've been doing quite a bit for AusIMM, Australian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy in Australia, for the AIG, Australian Institute of Geoscientists, internally within Rio. And the reason I wanted to do this, and particularly after talking with Barbara over a number of years and tried to fit in a talk this year, is Argyle's closing. It's a sad chapter, but basically from discovery in 1979 to being closed pretty much this year, I didn't want it to go out with a bit of a whimper. So it's really about sharing some of that knowledge across the group and a wider outside of Rio for people's information about Argyle. In Australia, we're not that well versed in diamonds. It's a very segregated small community, and Argyle really is it. So it's taking that opportunity to spread that out. I know that obviously in Africa and Canada, it's a little bit more widespread. But what I wanted to do today is start to go through some very basics of diamond geology. For those who are experts at it, apologies for that, but I really wanted to just go through let's go back to basics on how diamond deposits form. Let's then start to talk about maybe a little bit of history about Argyle, how it was discovered. I have another talk about that, but that's another hour, so we're not going to do that today. But then I'm going to start to talk about the geology of Argyle, what it was thought to be, how that got challenged by myself quite a number of years ago, and how we modified that and where it's got to. So let's start off. Let's go right back to the basics. Where do diamond deposits form and why? So ultimately, we're talking about a certain period of time in the Archean, 4+ billion years ago, where thick parts of the crust were forming. Today, you might get a 50 kilometres thickness of lithospheric crust, or maybe 25 during the ocean spreading areas. But in this bottom left-hand diagram, let's pretend now we're actually sitting in the mantle looking upwards towards the crust of the earth. So this would be the crust sitting out here, and this would be one of those periods of craton formation. People have different theories for many things, particularly in geology. I'm going with the most plausible ones and the ones that we're generally following. But cratonic formation is basically pre-tectonic plate evolution. It is where potentially magma plumes and things are coming up, welling up, and basically building really thick parts of the crust and forming cratons before they start to move around. When that occurs, instead of getting the 50 kilometres thickness now, we're sitting somewhere between 100 to 250 kilometres thickness of a lithospheric crust or cratons. And that is important. Why? For diamonds, if we're sitting outside in the mantle, we're sitting at about 1600 degrees. If we're sitting underneath the cratonic keel, the base of the craton, we're sitting at about 1200 degrees. And that's quite important because diamonds can survive in that heat, but they can't survive out in the mantle. If you look at somewhere like Africa, that is quite classic because you've got multiple cratons actually formed, say 5 of them, that bashed into each other a long time ago. And some continents, the cratons split, but generally in the case of Africa, they stuck nicely. And that's really the primary reason why there's lots of diamonds in Africa. There's lots of cratonic areas, hence there's lots of areas where diamonds can form at depth. Let's just go back to this. I like this. In a jeweler's case, if you go to buy this in a jewelry store, most people would reckon that you're not going to pay that good a price of it because they've got lots of feathers or glitzers or inclusions inside the diamonds. For a geologist, this is actually a wonder world because we have parts effectively of the mantle that are being included into that diamond, and of course we can study those. So it might be less value, but for us geologists, it has a plethora of information. I purposely borrowed, with the permission of De Beers, particularly these fantastic slides in here. I love these. They're an artwork, but really they're a geological artwork and close to reality as you can imagine. Effectively, we have a subduction zone going in here. We would have this thick part of the craton sitting in here. So that is the thicker part that is formed during the Archean. Down in here, we have peridotite and eclogite forming. All these white sparkly bits are effectively where diamonds would be forming. And then we have a pulse of magma, which might be ripping up through what we call the diamond stability field. So in this diagram down the bottom left, we have the diamond stability field. Why is it sitting there? Because again, we're at the base of this craton. We're at the thick part where we have enough depth, and in the top left-hand image, to give us enough pressure. So we need pressure to form diamonds, therefore we need depth. That comes with temperature, but we don't want too much temperature. If we have too much temperature, the diamonds will resorb and effectively go back into carbon forming solution, so they're not going to survive. So in this case, we may have a pulse of magma that has come up, basically has got to the surface, but actually didn't erupt, so we've got a blind pulse of magma. In here, we have another pulse that has come up and effectively it's hit the surface, it has erupted, and it's formed a volcano. That's all a kimberlite or a lamproite deposit is a volcano that effectively has formed its surface, and it has picked up the right material on the way through from the mantle. And hopefully, in this case, the pulse, if it is formed below the diamond bearing zone, and if it actually goes through the diamond bearing zone, if it picks up diamonds along the way, if those diamonds aren't resorbed because the pulse of magma gets stuck halfway up and resorbs the diamonds, if that makes it all the way to the surface, if that actually erupts as a volcano at surface, if that volcano is not eroded over time or is not covered by a lot of sediments and never found, then you may actually have a diamond bearing volcanic pipe. 1 in 100 of those that we find around the world can become a deposit. That's why diamonds are rare. It's hard to go and generate the things in the first place. It's even harder to go and find them, and only 1 in 100 of those become an economic mine. Where are they located? We can actually look at seismics of the earth, and effectively you're looking at those signatures of seismic which have a really thick continuous signal and showing those cratons, and here's where they basically sit around the earth depending on the depth. And to summarize those, you're looking at the Siberian craton in Russia, Karelian craton and Archangel and over Finland, Great Slave craton and over to Ungava in a lot of the north part of Canada. South America and India have great diamond bearing history as well. Africa is obvious, lots of diamonds in Africa. Today, we're talking about this little piddly little craton sitting in here. It's called the Kimberley craton. So back at about 1.8 billion years ago, the Kimberley craton belted into the North Australian craton in Australia and has stuck ever since. And along that boundary, we have the suture zones or orogenic zones or mobile zones. So ultimately along Argyle, we have what we call the Halls Creek mobile zone. And along the other side of the craton, we have the King Leopold mobile zone. Argyle erupted at about 1.2 billion years. The Allendale deposits erupted about 20 million years. So pretty much it's a case of when do these things open and close? And just because things are closing doesn't mean stuff can't come through, because when things close, they may lock together and open up spaces as they squeeze together. So it depends on when these are opening and closing is when we're getting the formation of deposits. They could be gold deposits, they could be nickel deposits, or in this case, they're kimberlite or lamproite deposits, diamond bearing deposits. Where's Argyle located? So the easiest way is to go and have a look at Google Earth. So for those, particularly in North America here, just remembering Australia is about the same size as the USA, sitting in here. So if we come back to Australia there, it would be like going from Perth, which is sitting down the base in here. So think of that as maybe LA, heading all the way up to Seattle, and Argyle sitting right at the top here. So it's about a 3¼ to 3½ hour direct plane flight from Perth. Been told it's the longest commute in the world. And when I say commute, I mean the last port that you're leaving your plane flight to get to a work site. So when we look to find Argyle, the easiest way is to look for Lake Argyle. That is a person-made structure. During the 60s, Australia had a number of infrastructure projects, and Lake Argyle was one of them. And the whole idea was to grow crops in the north to feed the north of Australia and to export out to Asia. Just to the south of that, we have the Argyle mine sitting in here. And that's basically sitting on what we call the Matsu Range. So if we tilt that up, Argyle, and we'll talk a little bit about the discovery at the moment. We've got the lamproite deposit sitting in here, cutting through the Matsu Range. We have alluvial diamonds, which are actually pouring down the creeks, in this case, Smoke Creek, under Lake Argyle. We then have alluvial diamonds also pouring out Limestone Creek to Lake Argyle. And then once it gets to Lake Argyle, effectively almost like the Orange River in South Africa, heading out towards Namibia way, we have the theoretically diamonds that would have headed through Kununurra, Wyndham, and out to the Cambridge Gulf back there. So for those who ask, are there diamonds in Lake Argyle? The answer is yes. Is it worthwhile mining? Absolutely not. And they're in very, very uneconomic forms and very small amounts. Back to the presentation. So again, we're talking about the Kimberley craton sitting up here, and now we're going to home into Argyle along the Halls Creek origin. When was it discovered? So again, I do a talk about this, which itself goes for an hour or two, but I'm just going to show a quick video to say what it was like in 1979. We're going to start off at Lake Argyle, and we're going to head along to get towards the mine itself. So basically 1979, I hope for those you with a lesser network band, it's not too jerky. So we're going to follow along what we call Smoke Creek in here. Back in August 79, geologists called Frank Hughes and Warren Atkinson, the discovery stones in the creek would have been right about here. They chased those stones up and effectively went back to the lab, found another hit here, another hit here. So Frank went straight to site and effectively has walked this creek, jigged and panned for diamonds along there. And as they continued following upstream along Smoke Creek, they were jigging more and more diamonds in their setup. We obviously wouldn't have had the village, and we wouldn't have had the airfield or the tailings dam. This is a newish topography, and I'm now going to show you the 1979 discovery topography here, prior mining. So they then continued up to Smoke Creek in here. Gap Dam wouldn't have existed. That's a new feature. The last few decades would have came around the corner. And at first, Frank thought that the diamonds were probably shed from what we call the ragged range conglomerates, which actually sit at the top of the mine here, and basically are Devonian conglomerates, which may have shed some diamonds. But as he came around the corner of North Hill here, up to what we call the jewel box, they were literally panning +4 millimetre stones and 4 carats a tonne. They then would have walked onto the pipe in here, what we call the Northern Bowl, up through the elongated pipe to what we call Barramundi Gap. So the gap, they would have been able to literally look over the plain where we currently have the process plant and all the workings from Argo. And they stood on the outcrop, and I'll show you a picture of an anthill in a minute of what they saw. They saw a diamond glistening in an anthill, recognised that diamond, and then recognised that they were sitting on top of a lamproite pipe. Back at that time, though, half of the lease was actually covered by a uranium explorer called Uranus, so they had to be very clandestine and kept that very secret until the lease expired in the next month, and then they started to peg it, and the rest is history. What I'm showing you now is actually the alluvial deposits streaming out from Argyle. So to the south, they would have formed through that gap into called Gap Creek along here. It would have poured over the ranges, literally in some of the highest grade parts of the deposit at 60+ carats per tonne, not carats per 100 tonne, but carats per tonne, and down Limestone Creek, and limestone confluenced with Gap Creek to form Limestone Creek down to the base, and then out to Smoke Creek, again out to Lake Argyle. You're seeing 3 colours here, blue, green and red. These are different paleo channels. So these are what we call A terrace, B terrace in the green, and C terrace in the red. So effectively over time, the terraces, so where the alluvial deposits shed, have changed, just like any other alluvial channel that changes over time. We jokingly say we've got the most expensive airport in the world, and that's actually quite true because our airport literally is built on diamonds. That was nearly mined at one stage, but someone recognised the sample error, that it was not as high grade as to be expected, and eventually they did not mine that. But there's the 3 different terraces, and we've mined right to about here, and the rest have actually been unmined because they're not economic for us. And the same with a lot of Limestone Creek down there hasn't been mined. Back to the presentation. So when they actually walked on that outcrop, this is what Frank and Warren would have seen. So they would have had a termite nest sitting on top of the outcrop, and there's actually the photo of the diamond in that outcrop in August 1979 there. So beautifully, the best subsampling technique you can do is use termites, because termites obviously take the grains from material, and the ones that were sitting literally on the lamproite pipe were bringing up grains of lamproite, grains of sand, and the odd grain, which happened to be a diamond. That's what the original outcrop would have looked like. So there's Lake Argyle in the background there. You can probably just see that whitish looking material. That's the end of the lake. Lake Argyle fills up about 9 times Sydney Harbour. So it's a very, very large structure. And they would have walked up upstream, up the creek, around the bend here, and Argyle, the lamproite pipe, is basically outlined in here, which is probably a bit easier seen by the stripping in 1980 when they started to strip the surface off. So it was literally a volcano with units which are dipping into the volcano on either side. What is the best analogy for the formation of Argyle? Surtsey is probably the best. This is sitting off the southern coast of Iceland in 1963. So they got the birth of a brand new island. So this thing is a phreatomagmatic eruption. Phreato meaning water, magmatic meaning magma. So just like if you put a pot of boiling oil on a stove and put some water on it, guess what's going to happen? It's going to be ugly. Things are going to spit and explode. That's what we're trying to model when we're modeling the Argyle deposit. And this is quite accurate, I think, of what the first eruptions would have looked like at Argyle. A year later, they take off in 1964, and Surtsey turns into this, which size-wise is about the right size for Argyle. It's also got a bubbling lava lake sitting on the top there, and we have one of them at Argyle, and it's called our non-sandy. So we're going to talk about the different types of lamproites in a minute, and it's really important because that first eruption of Surtsey, where effectively it was interacting with the ocean, personally, I believe that we have sand actually pouring in from this shallow deltaic marine environment, but then basically it's intruding into semi-consolidated sandstone wall rocks, and those sandstones are getting disintegrated and liberating sand, but it's a combination of those sand units which gets poured into the deposit. But that's only the first eruption. If we have a look at what Argyle historically would have looked like, back in the 1980s when they first drilled it out to about 150 metres, it was deemed to be an elongate dike. So in plan view, they pretty much got it right, except for a few lumps and bumps around the edges. And that wasn't too hard because it was a quartzite and mudstone host rock that it punched through a sedimentary unit. So it wasn't that hard to go and find the extremities. But when they looked in section view, they said, well, it must probably this elongate dike feature. Since then, up to, let's say, the mid-teens in the 2000s, effectively that was our model. And the model pretty much split it up into 5 domains, multi-lobe, multi-diatremes, but ultimately the lion's share of the deposit was these, what we call the South Sandy Low. So the nomenclature for Argyle, quite difficult. If in the south of this line in here, we call it the southern zones. If we go north to this line, we call it the northern zones. If it's got sand in, we'll put the name Sandy in it. And if there's no sand in it, we'll have non-sandy. And that's pretty much it at Argyle. So we have the main zone sitting down here, which is the South Sandy Low, low meaning high grade. We have a South Sandy high grade, which was a bit of an enigma because why is it sitting there? We have the southern tail, and we'll look at that in a minute. But basically that is a very thin, narrow part of a deep diatreme, and you'll understand that in a little while. We have our lava lake. That's our lava lake, bubbling lava lake that actually towards the end and the volcanicity just waned completely off. Now it hasn't got the Plinian style eruption at the very beginning of exploding throughout magmatically, but now we've got this little bubbling lava lake which has cross-cut the sandy material, and this basically has no sand in. And sand is very important with respect to Argyle. We'll talk about that in a minute. Grade-wise, this is what Argyle looks like. So again, we are talking carats per tonne. So our lowest grade material basically is that lava lake, and it sits at about 1 carat a tonne sitting in here. Generally in the bulk of the pipe, when we mined into the pit, it was around about 4 carats a tonne as an average, ranging from 2 to 5, but the reality is when you're in these high grade zones, that's plus 10 carats a tonne. Southern tail was plus 10, and we have samples in there. I think their highest grade was 66 carats a tonne. Remembering a tonne of rock at Argyle is 0.7 by 0.7 by 0.7 metres. If you now imagine you have 60 carats of diamond in that 0.7 by 0.7 by 0.7, you are not going to get 61 carat diamonds. You are lucky to get a carat diamond or maybe a 2 carat diamond, but then you may have a number of half carat diamonds and then a number of smaller ones, eventually where you're working down the scale, whereby you're maybe getting thousands and thousands of micro diamonds inside that rock. Theoretically, that rock should be glistening, but you never see the diamonds. So quite interesting. We pretty much had the biggest deposit in the world, 1.25 billion recoverable carats, recoverable in our case, meaning roughly about over 1 millimetre size that we wanted to recover. But the reality is Argyle probably was twice as big. And that's what has been eroded off of Argyle. So the earth has tilted 30 degrees. When you look at something like the southern tail and the southern end here, then really that is just a very deep diatreme base, the root system, which gets close to being about 1 metre wide at the base. And that's about the right thickness. If you talk to a lot of the players to say, how do you get the material up from the mantle? How wide is that zone? And it's roughly about 1 metre in most people's guesses. And that's pretty much where we get to about there. It might be a couple of metres at that point in here. But what it's saying is that we're deep in the system. Up here in the 1980s, just after it was discovered, they mapped lake crater sediments. So what that's telling you is that there's a volcano that formed. It had a crater at the top. Rain and water have been put into that crater, and there's material that is sloughed in, whether it's lahars or just material settling out with small eruptions at the end, and it's forming either shale bands or just sedimentary bands inside that crater. And inside that crater, they all form its own sedimentary package, lake crater sediments. They map them up here. It doesn't mean they're right at the very top, but they're pretty close to the top here. So we know that we're probably at the top of the crater here. We know that we're much deeper down in the diatreme in here, and we know we've got different lobes of the pipe. Looking at a little bit of the geology, one thing which was a bit of an enigma when I joined in 2003 was my first job was effectively to go and have a look at something like this unit over here. This is called the Hensman quartzite, and it's a big, thick, chunky, solid bit of quartzite. So that is really good stable ground. So when we went underground to look at the cave, my first task from day one was go and model something that looks as close to that as possible, but go below the pit and find out where it is. Now, embarrassingly enough, believe it or not, since the 70s, late 70s, nobody had modelled these waste rock units. Why? That doesn't pay the bills. We're only interested in this grey stuff down the bottom. That's the lamproite with the diamonds. Don't worry about this stuff up here. We just throw that away. Inevitably, they had a lot of structural failures towards the mid-90s. Some of these walls started to slough in. You may even be able to see up here, there's a bit of bending in the stratigraphy in places. So they are units that have actually started to relax and slough down. There was a big panic, a lot of drilling done for structural geotech purposes, but they still hadn't made a waste rock model to have a look at these units. So one of my tasks, as I said, the first one was to go and find a unit like that underground, which I did. I then modelled the units below that and above that, so at least they had a point to put the decline in. And once I finished that, I said, well, I'm going to go and finish the rest of the pit. So we might as well make a full-blown waste rock model which interacts with the lamproite model, because the days of not worrying about waste rock are well and truly over for acid rock drainage, for geotech purposes, for scheduling, for waste rock dumping, and so on and so forth. When I started to model these ones, you also have to remember that about where my cursor is here, this cutback here, all of this was covered with rill. So for the first year of my working career at Argo, I could not see that face, except for a couple of very small windows. But when I modelled any of the mapping from the past, which I had to bring in into 3D, and back then, what we take for granted in Leapfrog or drone photos or something like Cyrovision or Atom Tech or any scanning, laser scanning, that was only just happening in the very early 2000s. So basically, well, I captured all the historical data, chucked it into Vulkan, and then ultimately I was making models of these waste rocks, but something didn't work out towards the actual contact of the lamproite. And this is Oh My God Day in here, and this is Oh My God Day +1. So ultimately, at the beginning of 2004, you can probably see it's a white background because it was really cloudy and it poured down that day. But they'd finally cleared all the rill. There was a massive rain event, which probably dropped about 100 mil in half an hour, cleaned all the pit walls. And then the next morning I got up and I took this photo, and right in front of me, which I predicted, there was a series of what I call a sawtooth. So effectively the edge of the ore body was being offset by a series of structures, almost like putting a series of dominoes on the table, pushing the first domino and goes tink, 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 and they're laying along each other. So the ore body had been offset. Now, does this really matter? And the answer is we're just about to open up a block cave, and what's going to happen along the edges of the block cave, A, for dilution, and B, for geotechnical purposes, can we keep it open? Could we deal with it in the pit? Yes, we could. Were we going to hit some dilution and maybe lose a bit of ore? There was a potential for that. If we have a look at the left-hand side, it's quite interesting because you can actually see a hot contact and a cold contact. So effectively, this is the volcanic lamproite material coming up and interacting with the wall rocks, so almost like a metamorphic aureole. So there's the lamproite cooking up the wall rocks in here, and there's that aureole sitting around here. On this side, we're actually just getting a cold contact, which would have happened hundreds of millions of years later, where the fault has basically offset the ore body, whereas this contact is actually during emplacement of ore body. At the same year, in 2004, we hit this zone, and we called it the soil zone. And the soil zone, this is not a blast damaged area. So you've got to straight away look at that and say, yeah, they've done a blast. What does that mean? The blast was actually about 10 meters back from this face. This was natural material in the ground that when we opened up the blast and dug it away, this literally just crumbled in front of our eyes, okay? And you can probably start to see some slicken-sided surfaces at the back there. And if we zoom into that, then you can see the slicken sides along this surface. Again, these rocks are not from blast damage. These rocks are what is actually sitting in the ground. So what does it look like in core? Basically that, and a lot worse too. So effectively, we've now got ground up rock, which is why it's really hard to often drill holes at Argyle, and you'd often have two or three trials. You wouldn't worry about drilling a hole and then persevering it. Often you'd back off and just try through another area to hopefully pick some better ground. This is a shot that I took before understanding all that structure. And in the pit, we had this beautiful slicken-sided face. In this case, it was gap fault east inside the pit. So what does that mean? If we have a look at Argyle now, instead of being that dike structure and elongate dike structure, and I've only loaded a few of the major faults here. So they had one fault model from 1980, and that one fault they had coming through here and exiting down here somewhere. And whenever you talk to the geotechs in the pit, you say, hang on, the gap fault, why does it do this? And then suddenly it comes out here. And they all tried to convince me faults bend around and it took a bit of a right angle turn and it flipped up again and it did this. And they swore they could see it, but when it went down the pit, they could never see it. And really, which was code of saying, we believe the mapping from 1980s, but we haven't challenged it. And we'll try and make that model fit. The reality is it never fit. And what it meant is that all the sidewall contacts I could never map. And it pretty much got plugged into what they called a collapse zone, which was code for saying there's a whole lot of faults here. We don't understand what it's doing. We can't connect it up, but we'll just call it some sort of collapse zone. But really, it was a post-event of structure whereby it started to rip out all the ore body from itself. So this northern bowl in here, which in plan view is here, actually belonged down over here. And all of these dominoes would have shunted down and formed more of a locus in this area rather than being an elongate dike-like structure. This is an image of my brother-in-law's ceiling about 10 to 15 years ago at Christmas lunch. So after a few drinks and standing up on the chair taking photos of the ceiling, effectively they were building a mezzanine on the house. Mezzanine just means an open second floor. And effectively their mezzanine was being wrenched or was moving from the rest of the house. And I said, this is the best analogy of Argyle I've ever seen. So I'm going to use it in all my presentations. This is why when I was chasing structures up the wall, I could not see these structures head out. Most people say, I'm going to look at a line, here's a fault here, I'm going to project it about 15 kilometres that way. In this case, you could get outside the ore body, and if we go back to some of these images in here, I could see 50 metres of throw right at this point, but if you move up just a bench or two, you get zero throw. So 50 metres, 10 metres, 5, 3, 1, 0.5, 0.2, 0.1, nothing. So effectively, these were dissipating, and they're effectively tear faults. So these tear faults in a dilational jog and an echelon step dilational jog zone in here was pretty much what had happened to Argyle. Let's go and have a look at Argyle as a bit of an overview. So this is now looking, for those who haven't been or seen Argyle, there's our tailings dam, there's our process plant. Sorry if this is a little bit jerky depending on your internet speed. This is where our underground is. Our ore body are basically sitting inside of here. And what we've dug out around the ore body, the waste rocks have been dumped from the southern waste rock dumps and the northern waste rock dumps. There's the Matsu range, and as you can see, the bedding dips basically at 30 degrees. So everything's been tilted at 30 degrees to the north, effectively. There's our freshwater supply gap dam at the northern end of the mine. We're now going to come over East Ridge, and interestingly, you can probably see everything is dipping at 30 over here. But if you, with a keen eye, you could probably see there's a whole series of isoclinally folded rocks over this side. So basically this part of the mine has been performed differently to just to the east of the mine. This is a 2012 image, and I purposely use that because you can just see the grey in the base of the pit. That's the remnant lamproite just before we went into block caving. So we had a little bit left over at the southern end. Here's our northern bowl where that lava lake came through. And this would have been the area that would have been block caved, sitting right below there. Let's go and have a venture underground. So we're now coming past our process plant in here. We extracted all the diamonds. We're going to go underneath the waste dump. Ore body will be in green, block cave will be in red. So we effectively mined to there in 2013. And at that point, we're starting to create a block cave underneath that pit. We have declines coming down. One is a conveyor decline to bring up the material. One is an access decline. The best way to think of a block cave is you go down to the beach with your kids, you dig one dirty, great big hole as far as you can with your arm. You think you've done a really clever job. And ultimately right at the bottom of the hole, suddenly it gets a little bit wet. And as it gets wet, it caves in a little bit. So that's fine, I'll dig that bit out. And when you dig that bit out, a bit more caves in. And as you dig more and more, the whole thing starts to cave in. That's how a block cave works. And that's called our undercut level, which is that blue level in here. So ultimately we'll develop that blue level and we'll develop the extraction level in yellow. And when we get to that blue level, we'll drill up just a little way, we'll blast that material, we'll start at one corner and we'll quickly move across the undercut level of the body. So we might start at one corner over here and we transgress across. And the whole idea is that you're starting to make this rock crumble. And as it crumbles and collapses into the draw point, we pull it out at the yellow level, we tip it into the crusher and that heads up. And you want to try and keep this as flat and as even as possible. So you want to pull the whole cave as one big blanket. If you start to pull one area really heavily and not another area, in essence, what happens is that will get to the surface very quick. This will not want to break and cave. So cave management is its own art form itself. Now we're getting towards, let's say, 2014. And the problem at this point was up to there, if I just go back a few slides, up to there, we had mined in a pit most of these units in here. Now, as with most things in life, if you average out a series of domains, so let's call this a very high but skinny grade domain, let's call that a very high grade domain, an average grade domain, a low grade domain, and a moderate grade domain. And if you mine them out in similar proportions time after time after time, after each year, and it's roughly about the same proportions, you're not going to necessarily see a change in trend or what is happening in the unit. We can try and segregate these out and we can try and measure them, but with diamonds, for those who've been in the industry, we basically don't do grade control, because by the time we get the answer back for our grade control holes and our massive samples that we require, the diamonds would have already been sold months before that. So effectively, we have to make some assumptions, and understanding your geological domaining is critical. When we started the block cave and we drew the first parts of the block cave there, end of 2013, effectively we got less of these diamonds and we got more of those diamonds. And if I said you go to the jewelry store and go and buy a diamond for yourself or your spouse, then ultimately I'm pretty sure you'd probably pick these diamonds rather than those diamonds. These are full of inclusions in here, so the price is going to be less than the ones on the left, which are going to be high value diamonds. So what does that mean? Straight off the bottom line, we lost about 6% of value almost overnight. And that was the beginning, about Q1 of 2014. We then took another large sample from the workings, and we continued to look at that. And within the next quarter, we lost another 6%. This rang alarm bells, as you can imagine. So suddenly 12% becomes off the bottom line. What is happening here, and why are we changing the quality of the diamonds? We went through the process of, well, can you create problems with diamonds in blasting or in mining? And we didn't know about the inclusions at the time, or we knew that the quality was down. So we went through that, and the answer appeared to be no. Could we cause a problem with the process plant? We were not picking up good diamonds, or we were picking up more bad quality diamonds and it was averaging out to be on a poorer side of the quality, or was it X-ray not picking up something, etc. And we seem to knock those out. One sentence from Antwerp, our diamond sorters over in Antwerp, was we're starting to see lots more heavily included black inclusions inside of our diamonds. So generally that tells you it's not a person-made problem. So unless someone's sneaking in at midnight in the mine and then injecting somehow these inclusions into these diamonds, then this is a natural process, which means it comes back to geology. We've now got a block cave. So let's go and drill the block cave. Well, we can't drill the block cave. Why? Because the block cave is now moving. We're pulling material down. So the next best bet is to go and get tons of material up from the base of the block cave and a bogger and laid it down on the concrete pad, which is what I did. Unfortunately, this was in December, which is one of the hottest parts of the year. It's about 42 to 45 degrees Celsius. So that's me with a tool of choice called a hose, wetting the rocks and then wetting me, and then wetting the rocks and wetting me because it's so bloody hot. And ultimately, within about 4 hours, this is what I saw. Now, there's the iconic lamproite at Argyle. This is what we call bedded lamproite, okay? And the beds in here are effectively juvenile lamproite pyroclasts, or because I know Barbara may be on the call, these are going to be magma clasts and macrocrysts sitting inside of these units in here. The grey stuff along here is sand. It's bedded sand or sandstone that's been disaggregated from the wall rocks. We then had this unit, which after a bit of research, found out in the 80s, because luckily we have lots of contacts at Argo. I know all the people from the beginning, that this was called the ragged lamproite. This was not understood or seen, and this was not understood or seen. We'll get onto that in a minute. So the first thing to do, and this seems pretty obvious, but it rarely happens nowadays, get to know your rocks. So lots of cutting up. And in that time, I was actually working with Steve Moss out of Vancouver, and we did a lot of petrography. And apologies for my COVID beard. That's what I'm supposed to look like normally, and I just got lazy for the last 2 years. So effectively, once we went through the rocks, what did we see? And we're going to look through a series of macro, meso, and micro scales. So let's start off with a bedded lamproite. Here's the iconic view of Argyle. So you'll see all these bedded units in here, and you're looking at the lamproite pyroclasts, basically, sitting in these darker units, and all the light grey will be sand. If you're looking over to this right-hand side, you'll notice that there's beds. and beds of juvenile lamproite pyroclast sitting in here. So the magma clasts are in here with the olivine lode and diamond lode, and then in between it we have our grayer, sandier units. So these could be individual puffs. The way I see Argyle, we'll get onto this in a minute, is chances are there was the almighty eruption at the very beginning, but then afterwards there was very small but tens of thousands of little eruptions which effectively form base surges. So for base surges, for those unaware, if you go back to New Mexico, you go back to the nuclear experiments as World War II was going on, they let off the first explosions. The first thing you see is a shock wave coming out from that explosion. The second thing you see is a wall of hell coming at you, like in the Hollywood movies, and that's called the base surge. It's coming out sideways. The third thing, which everyone associates with a nuclear bomb, is effectively the mushroom cloud heading upwards. These are the sidewards ejection in the crater. We don't necessarily have to have the whole crater open here. We've filled the crater with a first eruption. Again, I'll talk about that in a minute. And then we may have small little fumaroles which are punching through and ejecting in tens of thousands of little eruptions, these base surges into there. And here's a classic example of the magma class and the macrocrucible sitting inside that. Let's look at mesoscale now. So now we're at 1 centimetre there. There is the magma class or juvenile lamproite pyroclast sitting in here. Here's the olivine lode sitting in, and notice that we've got large olivines, and we also have smaller olivines, which will be evident in the next unit. So as Barbara would quite rightly say, we potentially have olivines that are coming from the mantle, and we may even have smaller proportions of olivines that could even be generated as it's coming up. And we see that at Argyle as well. All that stuff in between in the grey effectively is quartz, or it could be very fine grain ash from the lamproite. We look at it in micro, again, we're seeing the lamproite pyroclast in here. We have olivines, stonking great olivines in here, and we have lots of quartz in between. So this is the sand. This is the sand either pouring in during the first eruption, and it's the disaggregation of, let's not call it quartzite, it's probably semi-consolidated sandstone wall rocks, which if you dragged a geopic down that wall, you would see grains of sand flying off. So effectively, this is taking out that sandstone. It is pouring in sand from the ocean until it gets landlocked and effectively mixing in with the lamproite. So we've got the highest grade deposit generally in the world, but it's already been diluted 50 to 90% by all of the sand. So the original grade would have been phenomenal. Here's what we call lamp 1H, and I've affectionately called the honeypot. So now that you've got your iron on the bedded lamproite, this also has a bedded sort of formation, but it can get so densely packed, basically it almost loses all of its bedding form. So in here, think of this as a bag of raisins. Right? A bag of sultanas in Australia, we'll call it a bag of raisins in America or Canada. So you've got a bag of raisins. Here you put half a teaspoon of flour, shake it up, and that flour represents quartz, the sand. So really you've got little bits of quartz wrapping around that. If we go back here to the bedded lamproite, this is like taking a bag of raisins but putting 3 cups of flour in and shaking it up. We've got lots of sand or lots of flour in between those raisins. So here this is class supported, whereas really the bedded lamproite is almost matrix supported. Here we're getting all of these magma class and olivines almost class supported sitting in here. And as you add a little bit more flour, in this case, a little bit more sand at each time, you can start to see that bedding and the dilution, which is the sand between it. Interestingly enough, the people out of Vancouver, Precision Mineral, I can't remember the name now, who do the polishing for us, they were really upset that they kept scratching these and they couldn't get the scratches out of them. And ultimately, when I found out which samples they were, when we went back to it, had recognised that the samples that had all these scratches that they could not polish out were these ridiculously high-grade samples. So what was happening is they were polishing the slabs, and the more they polished it, the more micro diamonds, the very small diamonds, sub probably 0.1 millimetre, were coming out and were actually scratching the samples. So it's a nice problem to have. Mesoscale. So again, pyroclast against pyroclast, or magma clast against magma clast against magma clast. And in here, we're having great stonking olivines and the classical texture between it. But if you have a look at micro, very little quartz, depending on how much the honeypot is actually contained in that material. So quartz really is a dilution problem here. It's just diluting the very high grades downwards. Here's that ragged lamproite. And the interesting thing about the ragged lamproite was the first time we actually saw where the mudstone was. There's mudstones in the walls as well as sandstones. No one ever knew where the mudstones was. It was assumed that, oh, it must go into bug dust and it's in the matrix there somewhere, but you'll never see it. So now ubiquitously, we can actually see mudstone spread throughout this ragged lamproite. So if we have a look in mesoscale, that would tell me that why is the mudstone only preserved in the first lamproite? Because that was the original eruption, and effectively the pipe has been filled with that ragged lamproite. Okay, and also if you have a look at these textures, they're like atoll textures or quench textures, or ragged as they called it in the 80s. So I recycled the name ragged. So effectively these are the same, similar lamproite, but what's happened here is it's been quenched, it's been frozen in wet sediments. So effectively it hasn't had time to equilibrate. It's basically stuck there as a series of ragged shapes. And what's all that, if we go back to here, what's all that black stuff sitting around here? Well, it's sand. All it is sand, sand, and more sand. And if you have a look around that in microscale, then there's the magma clast. There's an olivine caught up in the magma clast. It's diluted to buggery with sand, so therefore the grade effectively is down because the diamond content has been diluted right down. And if you have a look at the magma clast itself, it's black and it's aphanitic. So no matter what resolution on the microscope you look into, you cannot see texture. So effectively, it would have been like a volcanic glass. It would have been frozen and quenched in time. So what does that mean for the model now? So ultimately, we got to the point of saying, yeah, we had those 5 zones, which first thought to be an elongate dike. Then we had the 5 zones. But the reality is we now discovered the honeypot. And the honeypot, remembering the cave is sitting down here, actually punched through the cave. And no longer did we have one size fits all grey everywhere. We actually most likely had particularly the South Sandy major part of the pipe, probably would have had everything filled in the first big eruption event, which formed with ragged lamproite. And if Argyle was that only, would have never been mined because it would have had 1 carat per tonne at lower dollar per carat values, and Argyle wouldn't have been economic. And in here, then afterwards, we would have had a series of either smaller tephrogettes, which tried to work its way out. So 1 metre, 5 metre little vents, which are trying to punch through the previously emplaced ragged lamproite. And ones that did work could be, for instance, the honeypot. The honeypot was wide enough, about 150 metres width and about 15, 20 metres in depth in here, and then worked all its way to the top. And eventually that actually fed the South Sandy High. So the honeypot is just the feeder to the South Sandy High. And ultimately that would have been a successful version of one of these tephrogettes getting up and then forming. But then we'd have also had these other units forming at different times. So if we go to look at that and try to reconstruct it, Argyle probably, if you bring this back to here, and all I've done without a great amount of science is actually push this back to where I think it would have sat. And lo and behold, it's probably not coincidental that the edge shape of the pipe looks pretty much intact in here. Disregard this in here. I just hadn't had time to push it behind where it belonged, but ultimately it looks like a nice big V, and probably one of the more coincident pipes would be something like Victor in Canada, where it is a wider pipe, remembering that what the diamond pipe, whether it be kimberlitic or lamproitic, punches through probably dictates the nature of the pipe. So if it's punching through the Stormberg basalt in the Karoo supergroup in Botswana or in Africa, then ultimately you're going to get a steeper shaped pipe because it's punching through hard material. If you're at Argyle in a weakly consolidated sandstone, it's going to potentially open up and flare out into what people would iconically call champagne style effect lamprites, but it's really country rock hosted material that probably dictates the shape of the pipe. So it's probably a dual lobe pipe. We would have probably had 1 big unit sitting in here. We then had the honeypot punching through in plan view. We would have the southern tail forming at some stage, and we had the non-sandy that would have punched up in the northern bowl as well. How did we mine it? Briefly, from almost at the beginning, we've mined it from alluvials through to about 2002. So we're looking at Smoke Creek back up to the pipe here. Effectively, we stripped off that material. We put plus 18 straight back into the trench. We put -2, which was deemed to be insignificant diamonds in there, back as like a topsoil, and then anything between 2 and 18 mil went in a cement truck to effectively the plant. Even back then, which is quite a unique thing for Argyle and for mining in Australia. Even then, we preserved all the boab trees, which are iconic to the Kimberleys way back then. So it wasn't just a raise everything down to the ground. That's what the process looks like. So effectively, it's a dozer dragging along an alluvial grader, and effectively an excavator just filling that hopper into the alluvial plant. We open pit mined it from 85 to 2013. So that's a shot I took in 2003. I use this shot because at least back then you could see a significant amount of lamproite. That's the grey material sitting at the base of the pit. And back then, unfortunately, one of the lessons learned really was when people tried to connect the dots of the different ragged lamproites and the bedded lamproites, did the typical, let's draw a section through an ore body, just like a sedimentary deposit. Let's have drill hole 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and surely we could connect the ragged to the ragged to the ragged. But if you remember that first video I played of Surtsey, you're trying to now connect a volcanic eruption, and it doesn't necessarily work that way. So ultimately, they played that game for about 6 months, gave up, threw their hands in the air, and ever since the 80s, early 80s, it's pretty much been an engineering-dominated mine, which is a shame, which is mine the grey, throw away the red, okay? And it wasn't until we hit that quality issue in the block cave, which pretty much showed, hey, we've been reconciling pretty well over many years, but the reality is we've been mining really high grades, really low grades, and everything in between with different potential qualities and distributions. And ultimately it gave us a good annual result, but monthly it wasn't great. But when we got down to the block cave, there were areas we were no longer mining and areas we were mining. So the ease of mining everything and combining it together suddenly got thrown out the window. And that's what caused us a big headache, particularly with quality. Finally, we did go underground after a couple of slow starts, mainly the GFC in 2008 caused us a problem, and a flooding of the pit in 2011 caused us a problem. Here's a little bit of run of mine. So that's a classical Argyle product. We have some whites in there, but you'll notice there's lots of greys and the iconic browns. So the darker browns, ultimately we'll call them the cognacs in the marketing campaign back in the 80s and 90s. So effectively we had cognacs, and the light browns we'll call the champagnes. And for those with a good eye, you'll probably recognize that there is a pink stone. And that's probably about the right proportion. We get about 1 in 1,000, they'll say in marketing, it's about 1 in 770 stones will be pink. So it's a reasonably good ratio. Here was a special find in some of that petrography work. So here's a thin section, which they were trying to shave down. As you can see, the side of this thin is just a little bit thick. Why? Because they were hitting a diamond and they were trying to shave it off, and it took forever. So that's quite a rare find to go and find a diamond, let alone in a thin section. Here's obviously be remiss of me not to at least show some of our iconic product. So there's some of the Argyle pinks, some of the tender stones. So each year, and the last tender just happened a couple of months ago, which I was lucky enough to go and visit before it went offshore. We'll take about the top 50 to 100 stones. The last tender actually had a few hundred stones because it was literally our last one. That'll go around the world for tender, and that achieved record prices again. That's probably, for time's sake, Katherine, it's about 5 minutes to the hour, so I might leave it there and ask if there's any questions.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. I'll open the floor up to questions if anyone has any. Feel free to turn your camera on and unmute yourself, or you can send it in the chat and I can read it out loud.
I guess my question would be, when you did all the geology, were the pinks related to a specific phase, or were they pretty much everywhere?
Really good question. And everyone's been asking that since day one, to be bluntly honest. And they've had some mythical areas in the pit, but no one's really understood it. Why? Ultimately, because if you take that, let's call it 1 in 770 stones, just to get a sample with enough stones of all the different types of diamonds is enormous and expensive. So all we can rely on really in a proper sense is our mining. In other words, our monthly or our quarterly, or in best sense, our annual production of a mine. And if we swap over those different domains, if we mined all of one domain for a long, long time, it gives us a pretty good idea. If we swap domains, and specifically if we process them together and mix them up, then we have a bit of a headache, because we could take a different distribution of diamonds and mix them together. Now we're not sure whether we get more browns or better quality or different size, or in your question, different amount of pinks, or where do the pinks come from? Personally, I think from the very limited amount of sampling, I think I understand where the pinks are from now, but we haven't really tried and tested that fully. So if you go back to the original story, you would have seen the original eruption with a ragged lamproite. Chances are there's lesser pinks in those, but the following eruptions that came through with a higher grade material may or may not have more pinks. But statistically, we're very challenged on that. If we had another 10 or 20 years of mining, we'd probably prove that theory, but unfortunately we're closed down now, so I can't really definitively tell you that answer.
Yeah.
Okay,
Hey,
yeah, thanks.
Let's go, Jim.
yeah. Hey, Murray, it's Tom McCandless. I was curious. I'm not sure if I picked up then the quality diminishing in with depth. How did you ultimately account for that? Did I actually miss that in the presentation, or was it just a different compartment of diamond sampling in the deeper section, or was it reworking or something like that in the thing?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, good question. So it almost relates back to the previous question from Jen. It's not about, say, pinks and how much they were, but what we did see was a decrease in quality, and a very quick decrease in quality. 6% on one quarter and then another 6%, and it stayed there ever since. So effectively, we got hit with that the rest of the mine life. So given that we worked out it was a natural event, not a person-made event. B, that must be therefore a change in diamond distribution. Now, it could still be the same grade, it could still be the same size distribution, but the quality had changed. Or we could have quality changing and size changing and grade changing, or any combination of those. So what we did was basically try to, instead of prove where the quality change come from, because we might have to take hundreds of thousands of tons as almost a scientific experiment in a working mine. And at that time, because of historical assumptions, it was deemed the block cave was sitting in all that grey zone and one size fits all. So what I homed straight in onto Tom was saying, do I see anything texturally different? Forget about grades, because they're done on 5 meter samples and they're done with micros and they're making all these assumptions. Let's just go and use these two things and see texturally what looks different. And that's why that 4 hours on wetting those rocks suddenly came up with all those. Now, for some of those geologists back in the 80s, that was not a surprise, because yeah, we saw that. Well, great, you saw it. What did we do with it? Oh, we did nothing because we couldn't connect it. And then but we didn't see that, and we didn't see that. So then when I started to join the dots, particularly with what I call the honeypot, that class supported texture, then I could see that pipe coming through. Now, did that mean that the honeypot was a worse quality or a better quality? So they could have a lot more grade, but the quality could be down on that as well. So it has an upside and it might have a downside. And then ultimately, when we saw where that was located in the pipe, in the block cave, we then recognized that, oh, damn, a lot of that honeypot is not actually potentially mined, because it was all deemed to be one size fits all. So that honeypot potentially could have lower grade material, or the ragged lamproite could have lower grade material. And we looked for big chunks of ragged lamproite, but we couldn't find any. The honest answer in the long run is we never had the opportunity to take big enough samples of those units. So part of my hypothesis, I suppose, was to say, can we recognize those textures? Yes, that cost us nothing. Can we go and sort a whole series of rocks from bogger buckets and put them in drums and get some free help from our friends in Pilbara? Yes, and we did that. Can we go and assess those for micro diamonds and a small bulk sample of each of those? Yes. Was that definitive? No, because when you're only treating a few thousands of tons or hundreds of tons, then it gives you an indication, but it doesn't actually give you the definitive answer. The next step, which was never taken, which really was to dive in on a bit more detail of that sampling, but effectively towards the end of the mine, the rug got pulled, as in it's a nice to know project, but because we're closing down, why are we doing this? So we don't know the absolute definitive answer, which one the quality affected, but I have my gut feels about that.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, thanks.
Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Murray.
No problem.
I keep asking questions if no one's going to ask questions.
Go for it.
I'm full of questions.
Go for it.
I was last at Argyle in '86, and things looked quite a bit different back then. So let me ask you one of the arm waving questions. Is that you started your talk about the small cratonic representation of the Kimberley craton.
Yep.
And the Argyle sits in a mobile belt, and it's been faulted,
Yep.
and formed, and it's breaking all the rules of Clifford that anyone ever decided to invent after Clifford was long gone and dead. So,
Exactly.
But even so, there were geochemists who went out and dated the diamonds from Argyle, and they were 3.5 billion or whatever, and they said, oh, it still holds Clifford's rule, but clearly in exploration, you'd want to be looking in these kinds of settings as long as you knew there was some potential for cratonic rock underneath. Have you given some thought about that for this area and elsewhere?
I have, but I haven't gone into detail, and there's quite a number of people, whether it be so Linton Jarks, who we do quite a bit of work with, and who was involved in Argyle from the beginning of the 80s as well. You may be familiar with Linton, and others thinking about, you know, what the lithospheric depth is in there, and what are the cratonic settings. Personally, if I go back to the classic De Beers thing, all I'm thinking at the moment is that if you look at Botswana, South Africa, etc., and you're looking at a lot of places, Clifford's Rule and Dawson and so on and so forth, who would say, yeah, kimberlites off craton will just be non-diamondiferous, kimberlites on craton, and same with Clifford's Rule, that most of their deposits are sitting on here, which is why everyone concentrated on the thick, meaty bit of the craton and avoided here. This lineage just right here is probably, I think, maybe a great representation of Argyle. You're getting close to the edge. You're probably near the orogenic, the subduction zone in here. Personally, I think that, you know, if it's picking up the pinks, in my opinion, I suppose, from what I've been explained by a number of people, we know that they're stressed diamonds, okay? Pinks are effectively not pink diamonds. They're actually white diamonds with a pink color plane in it. And that pink color plane has been put under a lot of stress. You talk to the polishers of white diamonds, they'll say it's like polishing or cutting butter. If you polish a pink, for those who've ever worked with wood and you're sanding wood and then you hit a knot in a wood and it's really hard to sand, that's what it's like polishing a pink diamond. So chances are when the pink diamonds are under stress, and whether that's related to being close to the subduction zone and right at the edge of the margin, near the orogenic zone, our pink diamonds have been put under stress. Argyle shouldn't have happened with respect to pinks. It's a freak. The window to get a pink diamond is really, really small. You can take a white diamond, put a bit of nitrogen in, put it under stress, then it'll form a pink diamond, but very soon after that, it'll shoot to a brown diamond, and it's one-way traffic. It won't come back. You can't take a brown diamond and turn it back into pink. So ultimately at that time, luckily or unluckily, a magma pulse had come up, picked up 95% of the world's pink diamonds and brought them to surface. So it's a freak and it shouldn't have happened. So I think the fact that we're at the edge of the margin, that doesn't mean all deposit at the edge of the margin had pink diamonds. That was just a freak coincidence. But the fact that it's right at the edge, it's probably been put under stress, which may tell you something about the pink diamonds. The fact that it wasn't in the original model, that it shouldn't sit there. And I know there's been contentions about the thickness of the lithospheric crust, whether it subducted one way or subducted another way, or whether there's been bits bolted on. So when we look at the Horse Creek orogenic zone and saying that's where it is, it's sitting on the orogenic zone, is it really the expression of what originally the orogenic zone was, or has it been modified, if that makes sense? In other words, you know, we map it at the surface, but it's not necessarily what it looked like that after 2 or 3 events.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's great. I hadn't thought about the pinks either. That's really interesting. Yeah, thanks.
No worries.
There is a question in the chat from Mike. He's asking, other than cognac, champagne, and pink, what other diamond colors did Argyle produce? And he also says, great overview.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much for that, Mike. Look, if we go to having a look at, I suppose, of the run of mine production, you know, towards the end, they thought they got really clever because they had such a great... So look, if we go back in history, effectively when we were trying to work with De Beers back in the early days to sell it by the Central Selling Organisation, De Beers, the CSO, effectively they quite, well, I don't know about rightly, but they called this brown sugar. It was rubbish. Why would you want a brown diamond? The only thing you ever do is buy pure white diamonds. Why? Because you've got to put a big stonking diamond in an engagement ring and save up 3 months of your salary. And that's what history said to do, and diamonds are forever. So then, given that this was deemed low value and no one was really into the colours, then Argo was quite unique of rebranding those. So towards the end, particularly in the last, say, decade or two, we'd have what we call colours of the Kimberleys. And if you've ever been up to Argyle and to the Kimberleys, especially at sunset, most of it in the mornings, there's oranges, there's browns, and it really has a story about marketing or selling the colour of these stones back to what we product them as. So the champagne cognac was an extraordinarily clever idea of taking unwanted brown sugar and effectively turning into, my God, I'm going to have a champagne or a cognac diamond. So I remember the first week that I was employed at Argo in 2003, my boss there said, Murray, you need to understand the diamond distribution value chain. So go up the next level and go and talk to the people about the sorting and the processes. So I was quite excited, went up there and I asked, so where are the cognacs and the champagnes? They said, we don't have them. I said, oh, okay. I went to the next part with the sorters who were looking. I said, so the cognacs and champagnes are over here? And they go, no, we don't have them. Okay. And after quite a few attempts of trying to look at it, I went into the actual final sorting area where they had the different materials separated, and there was a bucket with B on it and a bucket with LB on it. And I said, what are they? And they said, that's the brown and the light brown. So yes, brown were cognacs and light brown were champagnes. So effectively, they were the big ones. The pinks then kicked in and people realized, oh, well, actually, these pinks could be quite good. And they've just gone gangbusters for the last few decades. They did have a go at calling some of these silver mist, which is probably maybe taking it to the extreme. I don't know if that ever caught on, but that's probably the main range. Now, we do have blues. Probably can't show you the video. That doesn't matter because I haven't downloaded it. But even in the last tender, we had probably up to 60, 70 blues, which were the last blues that we had. They're far rarer than pinks again and command that price accordingly. We believe they got boron in those steel blue colours. And a few years ago, we had one diamond, which was a true violet, and we believe that had helium in. So we don't get greens, we don't usually get oranges, but really browns are the main unit. We do get the greys, but we do get blues and pinks are our iconic. So we have sort of two ends of the spectrum. We have what marketing like me call affordable diamonds, and then we have the Rolls Royces, which are the pinks and the blues at the other end. So we're a bit of a dichotomy there. Hope that helps explain.
Are there any other lingering questions from people in the audience? Well, it doesn't look like it. So I will end the recording.